The recruitment station on Kepler 442b buzzed with activity as beings from across the galaxy lined up for military service. Towering Krillians with their crystalline exoskeletons stood beside sleek Vorthak warriors, their blue skin shimmering under the artificial lights. The air hummed with a dozen different languages and the occasional growl of predatory species who had learned to channel their aggression into service. Sarah Chen stood in line, her human frame dwarfed by most of the other recruits. At barely 5 feet 4 inches, she looked insignificant among the galaxy's finest warriors. The Krillian behind her let out what could only be described as a laugh, a sound like breaking glass. Another soft-skinned human, it chittered to its companion. They accept anyone these days. Sarah kept her eyes forward, ignoring the comment. She had heard worse during her journey to reach this remote recruitment center. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, having only achieved faster-than-light travel 30 years ago. Most species viewed them as weak, primitive creatures who had gotten lucky with their technology. The line moved forward, and Sarah found herself face-to-face with a massive Gornathi recruitment officer. The bear-like creature towered over her, its thick fur matted with ceremonial braids that indicated veteran status. Its small, intelligent eyes studied her with obvious skepticism. Species, it rumbled in heavily accented galactic standard. Human, Sarah replied clearly. The officer's snout wrinkled in what might have been disgust. It tapped its clawed finger against the datapad, scrolling through her information. No prior military experience. No enhanced genetics. No cybernetic modifications. Each statement was delivered with increasing disdain. Why do you wish to join the Galactic Defense Corps? Sarah straightened her shoulders. Because someone needs to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. The Gornathi snorted. Pretty words, Softskin. Combat is not about pretty words. It leaned forward, its massive head filling Sarah's vision. It is about strength, speed, and the will to kill. Humans possess none of these qualities in sufficient measure. Behind her, Sarah could hear other recruits murmuring agreement. A Vorthak warrior spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Officer Thrax speaks truth. Perhaps the human would be better suited to supply duties or communications work. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. With respect, I didn't come here to hide behind supply crates. I came here to fight. Officer Thrax studied her for a long moment, then shrugged his massive shoulders. Very well. You will be assigned to training cohort Delta 7. Try not to get your squad mates killed with your weakness. He stamped her papers with more force than necessary. Next! As Sarah moved away from the desk, she caught fragments of conversation from the other recruits. Humans, one scoffed. They think their little war movies make them warriors. Another added, I give her 3 days before she washes out. The barracks assignment took her to a long, low building constructed from local stone. Inside, she found herself sharing space with 7 other beings, none of whom looked particularly pleased to see her. Her bunk was positioned between a Krillian whose name translated roughly to shard cutter, and a reptilian saurian called Vex, who immediately turned his back when she approached. The Vorthak from the recruitment line was there too, apparently their squad leader by virtue of his species' natural command presence. He introduced himself as Commander Zhek and wasted no time in making his position clear. Human, he said, his blue skin darkening with what Sarah was learning to recognize as contempt. You will stay out of our way during training exercises. When combat scenarios begin, you will take support positions only. Your species lacks the reflexes and strength needed for frontline combat. Sarah set her gear on her bunk with deliberate calm. I'll earn my position same as everyone else. Zhek's laugh was like ice cracking. You will try. And when you fail, remember that we warned you. That night, as the others slept, Sarah lay awake listening to the alien sounds around her. Shardcutter's breathing created a low harmonic hum, while Vex occasionally hissed in his sleep. Through the thin walls, she could hear similar sounds from dozens of other barracks housing thousands of recruits. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, past the protests of her family and the skepticism of human military officials who had tried to steer her toward safer postings. Earth was still largely isolated, content to explore nearby systems and build up their own defenses. Few humans ventured into the broader galaxy, and fewer still sought to join alien military forces. But Sarah had always been different. Growing up in the slums of Neo-Shanghai, she had learned early that strength came not from size or natural weapons, but from determination and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. She had worked 3 jobs to pay for combat training, spent her free time studying alien anatomy and tactics, and pushed her body to its limits in preparation for this moment. The other recruits saw a small, weak human. They would learn differently. Outside, the twin moons of Kepler 442b cast strange shadows through the barracks windows. In 12 hours, training would begin. Sarah closed her eyes and began mentally reviewing everything she knew about her squadmates' species. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their cultural blind spots. Tomorrow, she would begin showing them what humans were really capable of. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was Jack muttering to another squad member in his native tongue. She had studied enough Vorthak language to understand, the human will not survive the first week. Sarah smiled in the darkness. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The training ground stretched across 20 acres of carefully designed terrain, featuring everything from dense forest simulations to urban combat zones built from prefabricated structures. At 0500 hours, the recruits assembled in perfect formation, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Drill instructor Korth was a Draknari, one of the galaxy's most feared warrior species. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with scales that seemed to absorb light, he possessed 4 arms and a tail that could crush bone. His yellow eyes swept across the assembled recruits like a predator selecting prey. Today you begin to learn the difference between playing soldier and being one, he announced, his voice carrying across the field without amplification. Many of you will fail. Some of you will quit. A few might even die if you are particularly stupid. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than the others. We will start with basic combat assessment. Hand-to-hand melee weapons and small arms proficiency. You will rotate through stations and demonstrate your capabilities. The first station was unarmed combat. A large circle had been marked in the dirt, and recruits were paired off based on rough weight and size categories. Sarah found herself facing a Krillian warrior named Razor Edge, whose crystalline protrusions gleamed dangerously in the morning light. This is unfair to the human, Razor Edge announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. My species' natural weapons will cause serious injury. Instructor Korth's tail lashed once. The universe does not care about fairness, recruit. Your enemies will not handicap themselves for your convenience. He gestured toward the circle. Begin. Razor Edge advanced confidently, his crystalline spikes extending from his forearms like natural swords. The other recruits gathered around, clearly expecting to witness Sarah's humiliation. She could hear whispered bets being placed on how quickly she would surrender. The Krillian lunged forward with surprising speed, his razor-sharp appendages aimed at Sarah's torso. But she was already moving, stepping aside at the last possible moment and using his momentum against him. Her elbow found the soft joint where his arm connected to his torso, and Razor Edge stumbled forward with a cry of pain. Lucky strike, Jack called out dismissively. Sarah didn't respond. She was studying her opponent, noting how his weight distributed when he moved, how the crystalline growths limited his range of motion. Razor Edge recovered and attacked again, this time more cautiously. But caution worked against him. Sarah had grown up fighting for her life in back alleys where hesitation meant death. She feinted left, then rolled right as his spikes swept through the space where she had been. Coming up behind him, she grabbed his arm and used a judo throw that sent him crashing to the ground. Before he could recover, she had positioned herself with her boot on his neck, applying just enough pressure to demonstrate control. Yield, she said quietly. Razor Edge's pride warred with practical reality for several seconds before he tapped the ground in submission. The watching recruits fell silent, their expressions ranging from surprise to outright disbelief. Instructor Korth's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught a flicker of interest in his yellow eyes. Next pair, he commanded. The weapons station proved even more revealing. Sarah had trained with everything from ancient human martial arts weapons to modern energy blades, but the Galactic Defense Corps used standardized equipment designed for multiple species. The training sword was heavier than she was used to, its balance different from human-designed weapons. Her opponent this time was a Saurian named Vex, the same reptilian who had turned his back on her in the barracks. Saurians were known for their lightning-fast reflexes and natural agility. making them formidable opponents in close combat. Vex wielded his practice blade with fluid grace, his movements precise and economical. He circled Sarah like a predator, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "Your species moves like wounded prey," he hissed. "This will be over quickly." The attack came without warning, a blindingly fast series of strikes that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Sarah had spent years training against opponents who were bigger, faster, and stronger than her. She had learned to turn disadvantages into advantages. Instead of trying to match Vex's speed, she focused on disrupting his rhythm. She gave ground strategically, letting him overextend, then struck at unexpected angles. When he came in high, she went low. When he attacked her sword, she attacked his body. The duel lasted longer than anyone expected. Vex's initial confidence gave way to frustration as his lightning attacks were turned aside or countered. Sarah began to press her own attacks, using the heavier sword's momentum to generate devastating strikes that forced the Saurian to give ground. The end came suddenly. Vex overcommitted to a killing blow, putting all his speed and strength behind a thrust aimed at Sarah's heart. She sidestepped at the last instant and brought her sword around in a horizontal arc that caught him across the ribs. In a real fight, the blow would have been fatal. This time, the silence from the watching recruits lasted much longer. The firearms portion of the assessment was almost anticlimactic. Human military doctrine had always emphasized marksmanship, and Sarah had been shooting since she was 12 years old. The Galactic Defense Corps standard pulse rifle was different from human weapons, but the principles remained the same: sight picture, breathing, trigger control. Her scores were the highest of the day by a significant margin. While other species relied on natural advantages like enhanced vision or steadier limbs, humans had compensated for their physical limitations by becoming incredibly precise with ranged weapons. As the day progressed through various other tests, obstacle courses, tactical scenarios, equipment maintenance, a pattern emerged. Where her squad mates expected Sarah to fail, she succeeded. Where they expected her to struggle, she excelled. Most importantly, where they expected her to give up, she pushed harder. By evening formation, the atmosphere in Delta 7 squad had shifted noticeably. The open mockery had given way to thoughtful silence. Even Jek seemed less certain of his earlier pronouncements about human weakness. Instructor Korth addressed the assembled recruits as the twin suns set behind the mountains. "Today you learned your first important lesson. Never assume you know your enemy's capabilities based on their appearance." His gaze swept across the group, lingering on Sarah. "Some of you learned this lesson the hard way." That night in the barracks, conversations were quieter. Sarah noticed that her squad mates were stealing glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Shardcutter actually nodded to her when she passed his bunk. Only Jek remained openly hostile, his blue skin darkening whenever she was near. "One day of training proves nothing," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "Wait until the real tests begin." Sarah was counting on it. Today had been about establishing that she belonged here. Tomorrow would be about showing them what humans could really do when pushed to their limits. As she cleaned her weapons and equipment, preparing for another day of training, she thought about the looks of surprise and respect she had earned. It was a start, but only a start. The real test would come when bullets started flying for real. 3 weeks into training, the emergency alarms shrieked across the base at 0347 hours. Sarah jolted awake as red warning lights bathed the barracks in bloody illumination. Around her, the other recruits scrambled for their gear with the practiced efficiency that had been drilled into them during countless midnight exercises. "This is not a drill." Instructor Korth's voice boomed through the communication system. "All squads report to the briefing hall immediately. Combat gear full loadout." The briefing hall buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of recruits filed in. Sarah noticed that the instructors looked grim, their usual air of controlled aggression replaced by something harder to define: concern, maybe even fear. Commander Valtros, the base's Xinyari leader, took the stage. Her insectoid features were unreadable to most species, but Sarah had studied Xinyari body language. The way Valtros held her forearms indicated extreme stress. 47 minutes ago, we lost contact with Research Station Omega-5 in the Kepler 442 system, Valtros announced. The station's last transmission was a distress signal indicating hostile contact. Long-range sensors detect multiple unidentified vessels in the area. A holographic display showed the system map, with the research station's location marked in pulsing red. The station was positioned near an asteroid field, studying rare mineral formations that could revolutionize faster-than-light travel. Intelligence suggests this is a Ravager incursion, Valtros continued, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah had heard whispers about the Ravagers during her journey to the training base. They were a nomadic species that swept through space like a plague, consuming resources and enslaving populations before moving on. Most civilized species considered them a myth, a boogeyman story used to frighten children. Station Omega-5 houses 47 researchers and a small security detachment, Valtros said. Standard protocol would be to wait for the main fleet, but long-range communications indicate they are engaged in operations 3 systems away. By the time they arrive, everyone on that station will be dead or worse. The implications hung heavy in the air. This was supposed to be a training facility, not a frontline combat unit. The recruits were weeks away from completing their basic training. Therefore, Valtros continued, we are implementing Emergency Protocol 7. All senior training squads will deploy immediately to provide assistance. You are no longer recruits. As of this moment, you are provisional members of the Galactic Defense Corps. The room erupted in a mixture of excitement and terror. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but her mind remained clear. This was what she had trained for, what she had come here to do. Instructor Korth stepped forward. The following squads will deploy immediately: Alpha 3, Beta 1, Delta 7, and Gamma 5. You have 30 minutes to prep and board transport. Any recruit who wishes to remain behind may do so without prejudice. Sarah glanced around at her squad mates. Shardcutter's crystalline surface was vibrating with what she had learned was excitement. Vex's tongue flicked out constantly, tasting fear scent in the air. Jek's blue skin had darkened to navy, indicating determination mixed with apprehension. Not one of them looked like they were considering staying behind. The transport ship, Relentless, was a sleek military vessel designed for speed rather than comfort. Delta 7 squad found themselves crammed into acceleration couches alongside the other deployment squads, their equipment secured in overhead compartments. As the ship launched, Sarah reviewed everything she knew about Ravager tactics. They were brutal but not stupid, preferring overwhelming force to subtle strategy. Their technology was largely stolen from other species, creating unpredictable combinations of weapons and defenses. Listen up. Instructor Korth addressed the squads through the intercom. Research Station Omega-5 is built into a large asteroid for protection. 3 docking ports, each leading to different sections of the facility. Intelligence suggests the Ravagers have taken the main port and are working their way through the station systematically. A tactical display showed the station's layout. Alpha 3 will take the emergency port and attempt to establish contact with survivors. Beta 1 will create a distraction at the main port to draw Ravager attention. Gamma 5 will provide fire support from the ship. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach as Korth continued. Delta 7 will insert through the maintenance port and proceed to the research labs. Your mission is to secure any survivors and prevent the Ravagers from accessing critical research data. It was a suicide mission and everyone knew it. The maintenance port led through the most dangerous part of the station, past the main power core and through sections that could be easily sealed off by enemies. If the Ravagers detected their approach, Delta 7 would be trapped with no way out. Jek spoke for the first time since the briefing. Why are we being sent into the most dangerous insertion point? We are the least experienced squad. Korth's expression was unreadable. Because the research labs contain information that could change the balance of power in this galaxy. Someone needs to ensure that data doesn't fall into enemy hands, even if it means destroying it. The unspoken implication was clear. They were expendable. As the Relentless approached the Omega-5 system, long-range sensors began picking up details of the situation. 3 Ravager vessels, each the size of a cruiser, hung near the research station like predators feeding on a carcass. Smaller craft moved between the ships and the station, ferrying troops and supplies. Enemy contact in 15 minutes, the pilot announced. All squads to final prep stations. Sarah checked her equipment one last time. Standard pulse rifle, backup energy pistol, combat knife, emergency medical kit, and demolition charges. Everything a soldier needed to fight and die in space. Around her, the other members of Delta 7 were making their own preparations. She noticed that several of them kept glancing in her direction, as if reassessing her presence on the team. The past 3 weeks had changed their perception of her capabilities, but this would be the real test. Human, Jack said quietly, his voice lacking its usual hostility. Do you truly believe we can succeed? Sarah looked up from her weapon check. For the first time since they had met, Jack seemed to be asking her opinion rather than challenging her presence. I believe we can do what needs to be done, she replied. Whether we all survive it is another question, Vex hissed softly, which Sarah had learned was his species' equivalent of nervous laughter. At least she is honest about our chances. 5 minutes to insertion came the announcement. All squads to deployment positions. As they moved toward the airlock, Sarah caught sight of the research station through a porthole. It looked like a metal growth on the side of a massive asteroid, its lights flickering irregularly where Ravager weapons had damaged power systems. Somewhere inside that station, people were fighting for their lives, waiting for rescue that might never come. In a few minutes, Delta 7 would find out if 3 weeks of training was enough to make them heroes, or just well-equipped casualties. Sarah sealed her helmet and checked her weapons charge one final time. Whatever happened next, she was ready for it. The maintenance airlock opened with a soft hiss, revealing the twisted corridors of Research Station Omega-5. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow, and the air carried the acrid smell of burned electronics and something else Sarah didn't want to identify. Delta 7 moved through the airlock in single file, weapons ready. The maintenance section was a maze of pipes, conduits, and access panels that made perfect hiding spots for ambushes. Sarah took point, her smaller size allowing her to navigate the cramped spaces more easily than her larger teammates. The first body they found was a Xinyari engineer, his forearms twisted at unnatural angles. Claw marks scored the metal walls around him, and his equipment lay scattered across the floor. Whatever had killed him had been thorough and brutal. Jack examined the corpse with professional detachment. Ravager work, he confirmed quietly. They like to make examples. The squad moved deeper into the station, following the maintenance corridors toward the research labs. Every few meters, they encountered more evidence of the attack: blast marks on the walls, pools of various colored blood, and the occasional piece of shredded uniform. Sarah's communication device crackled to life. Delta 7, this is Alpha 3. We've reached the emergency section. No survivors found, but we're detecting movement in the central hub. Recommend extreme caution. Copy, Alpha 3, Zek responded. Delta 7 proceeding to research labs. They reached a junction where the maintenance tunnel connected to the main corridor system. Through a reinforced window, Sarah could see the wider passage that would take them to their objective. It was also where they encountered their first living Ravagers. 3 of the creatures were dragging a wounded human researcher down the corridor. The Ravagers stood nearly 7 feet tall, their bodies covered in a mixture of natural chitin and crude cybernetic implants. Their faces were hidden behind breathing masks that gave them a skull-like appearance, and their movements had the predatory grace of natural hunters. The human researcher was barely conscious, leaving a trail of blood as she was dragged along. Her eyes met Sarah's through the window for just a moment, and Sarah saw the plea for help there. We need to save her, Sarah whispered into her comm. Negative, Jack replied firmly. Our mission is the research labs. We cannot compromise the objective for one person. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. She had joined the Galactic Defense Corps to protect innocent people, not to abandon them when it became inconvenient. She's still alive. We can't just leave her. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, Vex hissed. Standard military doctrine. Since when do we abandon our own people? Sarah demanded. Shardcutter's crystalline structure vibrated with agitation. The human makes a point. We are supposed to be rescuers, not just data thieves. The debate was settled when the wounded researcher screamed. The sound echoed through the corridors, raw and desperate. Sarah had heard that kind of scream before, in the alleys of Neo-Shanghai when predators found victims. She was moving before she consciously made the decision. Sarah burst through the access hatch into the main corridor, her pulse rifle already tracking toward the nearest Ravager. Her first shot took the creature center mass, punching through its crude armor and sending it crashing into the wall. The second Ravager spun toward her with inhuman speed, but Sarah was already rolling to the side, using a support strut for cover. Behind her, she heard Jack curse in his native tongue, followed by the distinctive sound of the rest of Delta 7 entering the corridor. Whatever their feelings about her decision, they weren't going to let her fight alone. The battle was brief but vicious. Ravagers were individually powerful, but they relied on fear and overwhelming numbers. In a straight fight, properly trained soldiers had significant advantages. Sarah's shots were precise and economical, each burst finding gaps in their armor or exploiting weak points in their cybernetic systems. When the last Ravager fell, Sarah rushed to the wounded researcher. The woman was human, probably in her 30s, with the soft build of someone who spent her life in laboratories rather than combat zones. Blood seeped from multiple gashes across her arms and torso. "Dr. Elizabeth Kane," the woman whispered when Sarah knelt beside her.
Xenobiology department, They
took the others to the main lab. They are trying to access the quantum research files. Sarah applied pressure bandages while Vex kept watch. How many others? Where exactly? 12 researchers, maybe 15. Main laboratory complex, level 7. But you can't. Dr. Kane grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. The research data. If the Ravagers get it, they'll be able to track every inhabited system in this sector. Millions will die. Jack appeared at Sarah's shoulder, which is why our mission parameters are to secure the data, not rescue researchers. Dr. Kane's eyes widened as she realized what he was implying. You're going to destroy it. You're going to leave them to die and destroy everything. If necessary, Jack confirmed. Sarah looked up at her squad leader, seeing him clearly for the first time. His blue skin had taken on the darker hue that indicated firm resolve, and his posture showed no uncertainty. He was a good soldier, following orders and thinking strategically. He was also wrong. There's another way, Sarah said. We split up. Half the squad escorts Dr. Kane to safety while the other half secures the lab and rescues the researchers. Tactically unsound, Vex objected. We lack the numbers to accomplish both objectives. We lack the numbers to do either one properly, Sarah countered. But sometimes you have to try anyway. Shardcutter's surface began resonating with harmonics that Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. The human proposes a significant risk, but the potential reward is also significant. Jacques studied Sarah for a long moment. She could see him weighing military doctrine against something else, something more personal. Finally, his skin began to lighten slightly. Very well. Shardcutter and Vex will escort Dr. Kane to the emergency extraction point. The rest of us will proceed to the laboratory complex. He activated his communicator. Alpha 3 Delta 7 has rescued one survivor. Require emergency extraction at your position. Copy, Delta 7. We'll be ready. As they prepared to split up, Dr. Kane grabbed Sarah's arm again. The lab has multiple security protocols. Voice recognition, biometric scanners, the works. Without the right codes, you'll never get in. She pressed a small data chip into Sarah's hand. Emergency override codes. But be careful. The Ravagers have been trying to break through the security for hours. They're getting desperate. And desperate Ravagers do terrible things. The remaining members of Delta 7, Sarah, Jek, and two others named Corex and Tane, moved through the station's upper levels with increased caution. The corridors here were wider and more heavily damaged, showing signs of serious fighting. Bodies of both researchers and security personnel lay scattered among the debris. They could hear the Ravagers before they saw them. Harsh voices speaking in their guttural language echoed from the laboratory complex ahead, punctuated by the occasional scream or the sound of equipment being destroyed in frustration. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as they approached their objective. Everything they had trained for, everything that had brought her to this moment came down to the next few minutes. Through a crack in a blast door, she could see into the main laboratory. At least 20 Ravagers were working frantically at computer terminals, while others stood guard over a group of surviving researchers. The prisoners were huddled in one corner, some injured, all terrified. It was exactly the kind of situation that military doctrine said was impossible to resolve successfully. The odds were overwhelming. The tactical situation was hopeless, and any attempt at rescue would likely result in the deaths of everyone involved. Sarah checked her weapon one more time and looked at her squad mates. Ready? Jack's skin had darkened to the deep blue that indicated combat readiness. For the record, this is suicidal. Probably, Sarah agreed. But it's also the right thing to do. She thought about Dr. Kane's words about the research data, about millions of lives hanging in the balance. She thought about the terrified researchers being tortured for information they might not even possess. Most of all, she thought about why she had joined the Galactic Defense Corps in the first place. Some things were worth the risk. Sarah studied the laboratory layout through the crack in the blast door, her mind automatically calculating angles, cover positions, and lines of fire. The lab was a large circular chamber with workstations arranged around the perimeter and a central data core that hummed with activity. The Ravagers had positioned themselves strategically, with guards at each entrance and technical specialists working on breaking through the security systems. "Orcs, you take the high position in the maintenance shaft," Sarah whispered. "Tane, circle around to the secondary entrance. Jack and I will go through the main door." She pulled out the data chip Dr. Kane had given her. "I need 60 seconds to upload these override codes once we're inside." Jack's expression was skeptical. 60 seconds is a lifetime in a firefight. Then we better make them count." They moved into position with practiced efficiency. Sarah watched as Orcs disappeared into an overhead access tunnel, while Tane vanished around a corner. Through her earpiece, she heard their whispered confirmations as they reached their assigned positions. "In position," Orcs reported. "Ready," Tane added. Sarah took a deep breath and activated the emergency release on the blast door. As it began to iris open with a metallic grinding sound, she was already moving, Jack close behind her. The first Ravager turned toward the sound, just as Sarah's rifle barked 3 times. The creature's crude armor couldn't stop military-grade pulse rounds at close range, and it dropped without making a sound. But the noise had alerted the others. "Contact," Jack shouted unnecessarily as the laboratory erupted into chaos. Ravagers were shouting commands in their harsh language while the captive researchers screamed and tried to find cover. Sarah dove behind a workstation as energy bolts seared the air where she had been standing. The acrid smell of melted metal and ozone filled the air. "Orcs now," Sarah called out. The Gornathi warrior opened fire from his elevated position, his heavy rifle sending devastating rounds into the Ravager ranks. His species' natural marksmanship in the high ground gave him a significant advantage, and 3 more enemies fell in rapid succession. Sarah used the distraction to sprint toward the central data core, pulse rifle chattering as she laid down covering fire. A Ravager materialized in her path, its clawed hands reaching for her throat. She dropped to one knee and put 2 rounds center mass, then rolled aside as its body crashed to the floor. The data terminal was protected by a transparent aluminum shield, but Dr. Kane's override codes should bypass that. Sarah slammed the chip into the access port and began the upload sequence. "Uploading now." "Cover me!" Energy bolts sparked off the workstation around her as Ravagers realized what she was doing. Jack appeared at her side, his rifle blazing as he cut down anything that moved in their direction. His blue skin had taken on an almost purple hue, indicating the kind of combat fury that made Vorthak warriors legendary. "Upload at 40%, Sarah reported, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen with agonizing slowness. "We have more incoming," Tane's voice crackled through the comm. "Reinforcements from the main corridor." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. More Ravagers poured into the laboratory, and the defending soldiers were being pushed back toward the data core. Sarah could see the terrified researchers huddled behind overturned tables, some of them wounded, all of them certain they were about to die. 60%, Sarah called out. A massive Ravager, larger than the others and covered in even more cybernetic modifications, burst through the secondary entrance. It carried a weapon that looked like it had been torn from a starship's gun battery, and its first shot vaporized an entire workstation. "Tane's down," Orcs reported. "Heavy weapons contact." Sarah could see the Saurian warrior's position, smoke rising from what had been his cover. There was no movement from his location. That left 3 of them against at least 15 enemies, with more arriving every minute. 80%, she announced, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The large Ravager was advancing toward their position, its massive weapon charging for another shot. Sarah could see the energy building in the weapon's core, a blue-white glow that meant instant death for anyone caught in its path. Jack stepped out from behind cover, his rifle aimed at the creature's head. "For the core!" he shouted and opened fire. His shot sparked off the Ravager's armor without apparent effect, but they drew its attention away from Sarah and the data core. The return fire caught Jack in the chest and shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a bank of computers. "Jack," Sarah called out but forced herself to keep watching the upload progress. 90%. 95. The large Ravager was almost on top of her position now, its weapon aimed directly at the data core. Sarah could see its finger tightening on the trigger, could see the energy building for a shot that would destroy both her and the critical research data. 100%. Upload complete. Sarah spun away from the terminal just as the Ravager fired. The energy beam passed through the space where she had been standing and struck the data core. But instead of destroying it, the blast triggered the upload she had just completed. Emergency protocols activated throughout the station, sealing off critical systems and transmitting the research data to Galactic Defense Corps headquarters. More importantly, the security override gave Sarah access to the laboratory's defensive systems. "Everyone down," she shouted, and activated the emergency stasis field. The laboratory filled with a shimmering energy barrier that froze everyone and everything in place for exactly 10 seconds. It was a safety feature designed to prevent accidents during dangerous experiments. But Sarah had found a more creative application. She used those 10 seconds to move through the frozen tableau like a ghost, placing shaped charges on every piece of Ravager equipment she could reach. When the stasis field deactivated, she was back behind cover with the detonator in her hand. "Fire in the hole," she warned, and pressed the trigger. The explosion was enormous but carefully shaped to direct most of its force upward and outward. Ravager weapons and cybernetic implants overloaded in cascading failures, filling the air with sparks and the smell of burned circuitry. When the smoke cleared, most of the enemies were down, dead or too badly damaged to continue fighting. The few surviving Ravagers fled rather than face whatever new horrors the small human might unleash. Sarah let them go, focusing instead on the wounded. Jack was alive but badly hurt, his blue skin pale from blood loss. "Status report," he gasped when Sarah knelt beside him. "Mission accomplished," Sarah replied, applying emergency medical patches to his wounds. "Data secured, researchers rescued, bad guys either dead or running. The reinforcements?" Orcs dropped down from his elevated position, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. "Dealt with." Apparently, they decided to retreat when the explosion started. Sarah helped Jack to his feet as the rescued researchers began to emerge from their hiding places. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team leader, approached with tears in her eyes. "We thought we were going to die," she said simply. "When we heard the fighting getting closer, we thought the Ravagers had won." "Not today," Sarah replied. As they prepared to evacuate the laboratory, Jack caught Sarah's arm. His skin had returned to its normal blue and his expression was thoughtful. "I was wrong about humans," he said quietly. "About you specifically," Sarah shrugged. "We all make mistakes." "No," Jack insisted. This was not a mistake. It was a lesson. He looked around at the rescued researchers, at Orcs checking on the wounded, at the destroyed Ravager equipment. "Perhaps there is more to strength than size and natural weapons." "Perhaps," Sarah agreed. As they made their way back through the station toward the extraction point, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first day at the recruitment center. The other species still saw humans as physically weak, and they weren't wrong about that. But they were beginning to understand that weakness in one area could be compensated for by strength in others. Humans might not have natural armor or enhanced reflexes, but they had something else. They had the ability to see impossible situations and find ways to make them possible. They had the willingness to take risks that other species considered suicidal. Most importantly, they had the stubborn refusal to abandon people who needed help, even when it would be easier and safer to walk away. As they reached the extraction point where Alpha 3 was waiting with Dr. Kane and the other survivors, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The mission was complete. The researchers were safe and the critical data was secure. It had been a good day's work. 6 months after the Omega-5 incident, Sarah found herself standing in the briefing room of the GDC battlecruiser Indomitable, staring at a holographic display that showed the Kepler-78 system. The star map was dotted with red markers indicating Ravager fleet positions, and the numbers were not encouraging. 17 heavy cruisers, 43 destroyers, and at least 200 support vessels, Admiral Kresh announced to the assembled officers. The Zignari commander's forearms gestured at the display with practiced precision. "Intelligence suggests they're massing for an assault on the Centauri." "Colonies." Sarah studied the tactical data with the eye of someone who had spent the last 6 months learning to think like a soldier rather than a survivor. Her promotion to lieutenant had come with intensive training in fleet operations, xenobiology, and advanced combat tactics. She was no longer the uncertain recruit who had barely scraped through basic training. Estimated civilian population in the target zone, asked Captain Thorne, a veteran human officer who commanded one of the few Earth-built ships in the fleet. Approximately 2 million across 12 colony worlds, Admiral Kresh replied. Evacuation is impossible given the time constraints. We have perhaps 48 hours before the Ravager fleet reaches the outer colonies. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Galactic Defense Corps fleet in the area consisted of only 8 ships, barely a tenth of the enemy force. Even with their technological advantages, those odds were essentially hopeless. "What are our orders, Admiral?" Captain Vorthak asked. Admiral Kresh's insectoid features were impossible to read, but her body language conveyed resignation. "We will engage the enemy fleet and attempt to delay their advance long enough for civilian evacuation efforts to begin. All ships are to fight to the last shot and the last breath." It was a death sentence, elegantly phrased but unmistakable in its meaning. The fleet would die buying time for civilians they couldn't really save. Sarah raised her hand. "Admiral, request permission to speak." Admiral Kresh's compound eyes focused on her. Over the past months, Sarah had gained something of a reputation as someone who found unconventional solutions to impossible problems. "Proceed, Lieutenant Chen." "I've been studying Ravager fleet tactics since Omega-5, Sarah began, activating her personal data pad. "They rely on overwhelming force and psychological intimidation, but their command structure has a critical weakness." The holographic display shifted to show a detailed breakdown of Ravager fleet organization. They use a hierarchical control system with all tactical decisions flowing from the flagship. Destroy the command ship, and the rest of the fleet becomes essentially leaderless for several hours while they reorganize. "An interesting observation," Admiral Kresh replied, "but their flagship will be at the center of their formation, protected by layers of escorts. No conventional attack could reach it." "No conventional attack, yes," Sarah agreed. "But what if we don't use a conventional attack?" She manipulated the display to show the asteroid field at the edge of the Kepler-78 system. "The Ravagers will have to pass through this field to reach the colonies. They'll spread out to avoid collisions, creating gaps in their formation." Captain Thorne leaned forward, interest evident in his expression. "You're proposing an ambush." "Not exactly," Sarah said. "I'm proposing we become the asteroids." The room erupted in confused murmurs until Sarah explained her plan. "We disguise our ships as space debris, power down to minimal signatures, and let the Ravager fleet pass around us. Once their flagship is isolated, we activate an attack from within their formation." "Tactically unsound," Admiral Kresh stated immediately. "Our ships would be surrounded with no avenue of retreat." "Yes," Sarah acknowledged. "But retreat was never really an option anyway. At least this way we might actually accomplish something before we die." The debate that followed was intense but brief. Time was running short, and conventional tactics offered no hope whatsoever. Sarah's plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was also the only strategy that offered even a remote chance of success. 12 hours later, the GDC fleet hung motionless in the asteroid field, their hulls covered with metallic debris and their power signatures reduced to near zero. Sarah stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching long-range sensors track the approaching Ravager armada. "Contact in 30 minutes, reported the sensor operator, a nervous saurian whose tongue flicked out constantly as he monitored his instruments. Admiral Kresh moved between the bridge stations with the calm efficiency of a seasoned commander. "All ships report ready," she announced. "Weapons charged, engines on standby. Remember, we get one chance at this." Sarah found herself thinking about the 2 million civilians in the Centauri colonies, people who had no idea that their lives depended on 8 ships hiding among asteroids like prey, hoping to avoid predators. She thought about Dr. Kane and the other researchers from Omega-5, safe now because someone had been willing to take an impossible risk. Ravager Vanguard entering the field, the sensor operator reported. The waiting was the worst part. Through the ship's external cameras, Sarah could see Ravager vessels passing by like massive predators, moving through a dark forest. Their hulls were scarred and patched, showing the accumulated damage of countless raids. Some bore trophies taken from their victims, hull plating from civilian ships, weapon arrays from defeated warships. and worse things that Sarah preferred not to identify. "Flagship detected," came the whispered report. "Bearing 27 Mark 8, range 4,000 kilometers." The Ravager command ship was enormous, easily twice the size of the largest GDC vessel. Its hull bristled with weapons and sensor arrays, and smaller ships swarmed around it like remora fish around a shark. "All ships, this is Admiral Kresh," came the fleet-wide communication. "Prepare for activation on my mark. Target the flagship's command sections and engine compartments. Make every shot count." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the final seconds ticked away. Everything they had trained for, everything the Galactic Defense Corps stood for, came down to the next few minutes. "Mark," Admiral Kresh said quietly. 8 ships sprang to life simultaneously, their engines flaring as they shed their asteroid disguises. The Indomitable surged forward with its sister ships, weapons charging as they closed the distance to their target. The Ravager response was immediate but confused. Alarms wailed across their fleet as ships that had seemed like lifeless debris suddenly became deadly threats. The flagship's escorts moved to intercept, but they were too far away and moving in the wrong directions. "Firing," reported the weapons officer. The Indomitable's main guns spoke with authority, sending streams of coherent energy into the Ravager flagship's hull. Around them, the other GDC ships added their own firepower to the barrage. For a moment, it seemed like the plan might actually work. Then the Ravagers began to return fire. The space around the GDC fleet exploded into a hell of energy beams and missile trails. The smaller destroyer Resolute took a direct hit from a heavy plasma cannon and broke apart in a brilliant flash. The cruiser Defiant lost its forward section to a torpedo strike, but kept fighting with its remaining weapons. "Flagship's shields are failing," the sensor operator reported with excitement. Sarah watched the tactical display as their concentrated firepower slowly overwhelmed the Ravager command ship's defenses. Piece by piece, section by section, they were tearing the massive vessel apart. "All ships concentrate fire on the command tower," Admiral Kresh ordered. The final assault was devastating. 8 ships pouring everything they had into a single target, their combined firepower finally breaking through layers of armor and shielding to reach the vital systems beneath. The Ravager flagship's command tower exploded in a pillar of fire that could be seen across the entire battlefield. "Flagship is destroyed," someone shouted over the communications network. Across the Ravager fleet, ships began to slow and drift as their coordinated attack patterns collapsed. Without central command, individual captains found themselves isolated and uncertain, their overwhelming numerical advantage suddenly meaningless. But the GDC fleet had paid a terrible price for their victory. Of the 8 ships that had begun the battle, only 3 were still fighting. The Indomitable had taken severe damage to her port side, and fires were burning in multiple compartments. "Admiral," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving a fleet-wide transmission from the remaining Ravager forces." "Put it through," Admiral Kresh ordered. The voice that came through the speakers was harsh and alien, speaking heavily accented Galactic standard. "GDC forces, you have fought well. Our fleet commander is dead, our mission is ended. We withdraw with honor." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. The Ravagers were retreating. The colonies were safe. As the enemy fleet began to turn away from the Centauri system, Admiral Kresh activated the ship-wide communication system. "All hands, this is the Admiral. Mission accomplished. The Ravager threat has been neutralized." The cheers that echoed through the ship were subdued by the knowledge of how many had died to achieve this victory. But they had won, against impossible odds and at terrible cost. Later, as damage control teams worked to repair the Indomitable, Admiral Kresh found Sarah in the ship's observation lounge. "Saint,"